Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Maurice Renard's essay Du roman merveilleux scientifique et de son action sur l'intelligence du progrès, or Scientific Marvel Fiction and its Effect on the Consciousness of Progress. So this is Renard's attempt from October 1909 to kind of define science fiction, right? To establish the basis of what we would today call science fiction. He calls it scientific marvel fiction, or his term is le roman merveilleux scientifique. So scientific marvel fiction. But again, what we would today call science fiction. That term ultimately won out over scientific marvel fiction. And he is attempting to sort of establish this genre. What are its characteristics? What makes it distinct? Why is it important? And science fiction has definitely changed a lot since the days of Renard, especially at the peak of his powers, which was sort of pre-World War I. He did continue writing afterwards, but it seems, according to the introduction in this book, this is the Black Coat Press edition of Dr. Learn, which includes this essay. According to the introduction, he did continue writing, but he sort of drifted slightly away from science fiction, and when he did write science fiction, it became increasingly derivative and formulaic as he sort of despaired of finding a proper receptive audience for science fiction in France itself. But he came up with this theory, and I think it's an interesting foundational way of looking at science fiction. So one of the things he says here, scientific marvel fiction is, in fact, the form of contemporary literature that embodies the most philosophy, which is philosophy set on a stage, logic dramatized. Born of science and reasoning, its attempts to advance one with the aid of the other, and it appears to us, in fact, with its noble, instructive, and moralistic tendencies, and its immediate or eventual educative effect, to be one of the finest creations of the human mind, a great work of art which only seems small to those who are too distant from it by virtue of an optical illusion, and which can only appear childish to puerile minds. So, the marriage of philosophy and science has created this new art form. And what he essentially says is that science fiction, or scientific marvel fiction, to use his term, I'm going to try and keep using his term, but I will probably keep saying science fiction because that's what I'm more used to saying. But what he says is that scientific marvel fiction is basically born out of two of the three epistemological conditions. So there are things that we know for a fact, things that we know for sure, that we are certain of. There are things that we think are correct, but we're uncertain of. And there are things that we don't know. It's these latter two, things that we're uncertain of or things that we don't know, that give birth to science fiction. Because essentially, to scientific marvel fiction, because essentially what Renard argues is that scientific marvel fiction takes science that currently exists. It takes what we know about the world, it takes existing technologies, it takes existing discoveries, etc., and it proposes a fallacy, he calls it. Hypothesis, in a way. It might be a better way of explaining it. It basically says, what if? And this is part of the reason why, probably quite unfairly, he excludes an author like Jules Verne from the scope of scientific Marvel fiction, because Renard argues that Verne's his writing is dependent on existing scientific information. Burns may slightly expand them, but he doesn't fundamentally do anything new with them. You think about a book like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, for instance. Submarines already existed when Burns wrote that book, or they were near to discovery. And so for Renard, that is not really scientific Marvel fiction, because it takes an existing technology and puts it out in the world. Again, I'm not sure this is a fair assessment, because the submarine that Verne envisions in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Nautilus, is so much more advanced than anything that was even really conceivable to be built at the time. But Renard, so that's Renard's position nonetheless on Burns. He's much more a fan of somebody like H.G. Wells, who says, okay, we know that Mars exists. What if we know some characteristics of Mars? What if there were creatures on Mars that wanted to conquer the Earth? And so that's really what Renard is interested in terms of scientific Marvel fiction, is we know this thing, we don't know these things, or we're unsure of these things. So let's imagine potential answers. And what he says here, he describes this sort of technique of introducing uncertainty. He says, we are therefore forced to seek our romantic themes in the unknown and the uncertain. As we are concerned with scientific marvels, however, how can we reconcile the seemingly contradictory demand that we take our subject matter from both within science and from that which is not science? We act exactly as the scientist does who wishes to tackle the problems of the unknown. We apply the methods of scientific investigation to the unknown and the dubious. But how then do our imaginary solutions differ from the verifiable solutions of science? In other words, since we do not know for sure how to make true discoveries, what distinguishes the reasoning of the scientific marvelous from scientific reasoning? It is the voluntary introduction into the chain of propositions of one of several false elements, whose nature is to determine in consequence the appearance of the marvelous being, object, or fact. Marvelous, meaning that which seems to us to be presently marvelous, for the future might demonstrate that the supposedly defective element was not defective at all, and that our scientific marvel was purely and simply scientific. So basically, again, the idea is that scientific Marvel fiction takes what we know about science and then moves beyond it into the realm of the uncertain or the completely unknown, and basically says, what if? What if this happened? And the author tries to work through that hypothetical in their mind to figure out what would happen if dinosaur eggs survived intact and hatched, which is the premise of Les Vacances de Monsieur Dupont, which I've done a video about as well. Or what if there were creatures on Mars that wanted to invade Earth? What if someone built a time machine, etc., etc.? All of these kinds of things And what he says is important about this. This is really, so that's the basic formula, right? Is to build from existing science and to imagine what could possibly the answers to remaining questions. What he says here, why this matters. He says, after reading The Invisible Man or In the Abyss, for example, we no longer see things from the same angle. And having asked what relationships have been modified, what proportions changed, I have perceived that the confused disturbance of our judgments comes, in the final analysis, from the effect of the scientific marvelous on the consciousness of progress. So that is it. So essentially what he means here is that scientific marvel fiction expands the horizon of possibilities for what we think, what we imagine could be. Right? So it presents us with hypotheticals, it presents us with scenarios that challenge the limitations of what we currently know and ask us to think more about what could be true in the world. So it invites us to imagine further possibilities. And he says here, and actually he kind of argues without providing much concrete evidence for it, it's a hypothetical sort of argument, that because scientific marvel fiction asks us to expand how we think about the possibilities of science, that it in fact has a progressive potentiality. So he says here, the influence of scientific marvel fiction on such a conception of progress is considerable. With a force of conviction drawn from reason itself, it brutally unveils for us everything that the unknown and the doubtful might perhaps hold in reserve, everything in the depths of the inexplicable that might become disagreeable or horrible to us, everything that the sciences are capable of discovering and extrapolating beyond the accomplished inventions that seem to us to be the terminus, all the lateral consequences, all the unexpected and possible consequences of those same investigations, and also all the new sciences that might emerge for the study of previously unsuspected phenomena, which might create new needs for us in creating and in advance the means to nourish or pander to them. It shows us our petty way of life upset by the most natural and yet the most unexpected cataclysms. It reveals to us in a new and gripping clarity the instability of contingencies, the imminent menace of the possible. It infects us with the nauseous malaise of doubt. Finally, by its means, all the horror of the unknown appears to us with a terrible intensity. It uncovers for us the incommensurable space to be explored outside our immediate well-being. It pitilessly detaches from the idea of science any afterthought of domestic usage and any sentiment of anthropocentrism. It breaks our habits of thought and transports us to other points of view outside ourselves. So essentially what Renard comes down on is this idea that because scientific marvel fiction challenges what we believe to be the limits of science by asking us to imagine answers to unknown or unknowable at this point questions, that it prompts us to think about the possibilities raised by these questions. It prompts us to think about how we could action those answers. And what I mean by that is what we could do scientifically to discover answers to questions that scientific marvel fiction or science fiction has posed speculative answers to.